I grew up on a cattle farm with my dad. It was just the two of us after my mom left when I was a kid. We weren't rich, but the farm kept food on the table. It was quiet, predictable work until it wasn't. It started with the cows going missing. We lost one, then another a few days later. At first, we thought it was a coyote or a mountain lion. But then we found the fence cut, a clean, straight slice through the wire. Not chewed, not broken, cut. That was the first sign that something wasn't right. We set up lights near the pasture, hoping to deter whatever was sneaking in. A few nights went by with nothing happening, and we started to think maybe it was just some kids messing around. But then, one night, I saw them. 3 people stood by the fence, just standing, not moving, not talking. They were too far to make out their faces, just silhouettes in the dark. I grabbed my rifle, stepped onto the porch, and yelled, "You need to get the hell off my land." They didn't flinch. They just stood there, watching. I fired a warning shot into the air, and the second the sound cracked through the night, they turned and bolted, straight into the woods. No hesitation, no looking back. Just gone. The next morning, my dad and I checked the fence where they had been. That's when we found the symbol, carved deep into a tree near the house. It wasn't letters, just some kind of symbol, like a twisted spiral with lines cutting through it. I don't know how long it had been there, but I know it wasn't there before. We called the sheriff. He looked at the tree, looked at us, and shrugged. "Teenagers, probably messing with you." That was it. No investigation, no patrols. Just a shoulder shrug and a warning to keep an eye out. So we did. We kept an eye out. And that's when things got worse. A few nights later, I woke up to our dog, Buddy, going nuts. Growling, barking, pacing at the front door. I grabbed my rifle and stepped out onto the porch. The night was dead quiet, except for the sound of heavy breathing. Not mine. Not Buddy's. Something was breathing out in the dark. I swung the rifle up, scanning the yard. The moon was bright enough that I could see pretty far, but I didn't see anything. Then I heard a whisper, a real clear whisper, like someone was standing just beyond the light. "Ethan." I swear to God, my blood ran cold. I backed up to the door, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Just empty space. The next morning, my dad found another symbol, this time carved into the wood of our barn. Same twisted spiral, same deep cuts, like someone had spent hours making sure it lasted. We were on edge for the next few nights, barely sleeping, always watching. Then it all came to a head. I decided I wasn't going to let them control our lives. I sat outside that night, rifle across my lap, watching the fields. Hours passed. Nothing. Just the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. Then the breathing started again. This time it was right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell over. But there was nothing there. Just empty space and the barn looming in the darkness. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched by the barn, just at the edge of the shadows. Watching me, I raised my rifle, but before I could get a shot off, it melted back into the dark. Not ran. Melted like it was never really there to begin with. The next morning, my dad and I went out to check the cattle, and that's when we saw it. Every single one of our cows dead. Their bodies arranged in a perfect circle in the middle of the field. Not a drop of blood anywhere. Just cold, lifeless animals, placed with precision. We packed up that day, took what we could and left. The farm had been in our family for generations, but none of that mattered anymore. Whatever was out there didn't want us there, and we weren't going to stick around to find out why. A week later, my dad got a call from the new owner. He sounded shaken, paranoid. Said he had seen people standing in the field at night. Said they didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. He lasted 3 weeks before he left too. That was years ago. The farm's changed hands 4 times since then. Every owner leaves faster than the last. The place just sits there now, empty, overgrown, waiting. When my husband, Mark, and I moved into the old farmhouse, we knew it needed work. It was one of those places with charm, The kind you convince yourself will be beautiful with a little love. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Thompson, seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys. Everything was normal until he mentioned the locked room. That door. He gestured toward it, looking uncomfortable. Previous owner never opened it. I don't have a key, and I'd suggest you leave it alone. It was an odd thing to say, but at the time we shrugged it off. The first few weeks were uneventful. We were too busy fixing leaky pipes and painting walls to think much about the room. But the door was always there. In the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder what was behind it. One night, after a couple of drinks, Mark and I stood in front of it, debating. "It's probably just a storage closet," he said. "Nothing in there but old junk." "Then why would it be locked?" I countered. "And why did he tell us not to open it?" Mark rolled his eyes but grabbed a screwdriver anyway. It wasn't easy, but eventually, the door creaked open. The air inside was thick with dust, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. And all that was inside was a single wooden chair. That wasn't the strangest part. The walls, pale and cracked, were covered in deep scratch marks. Not random ones, but deliberate, desperate gouges. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Then I saw the chain. It hung from the inside of the door, bolted to the wall with a heavy latch, like someone had locked themselves in. A deep unease settled in my chest, but Mark just scoffed. Probably some old-timey punishment room or something. I wasn't convinced. Something about that room felt wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard something. A faint, rhythmic scratching. Slow, deliberate. I shook Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned. "It's mice, Em. We're in the middle of nowhere. What do you expect?" But it didn't sound like mice. The sound wasn't scurrying, it was scraping. Came from the walls. From that room. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched crept in. I'd be washing dishes and feel something behind me. Walking down the hallway, I'd swear I saw a shadow in my peripheral vision. First, I brushed it off. Moving into a new place can be unsettling. But it got worse. One evening, I passed the room and something made me stop. The door was open. We had left it closed. And the chair was no longer in the middle of the room. It was facing the doorway. Facing me. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. "Mark!" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you move the chair?" "What chair?" he called from the living room. I grabbed his arm and dragged him to the room. He frowned at the chair but shrugged. "Maybe the floor's uneven." It wasn't, and he knew it, but he didn't want to talk about it. That night, I set up a camera. I needed to know if I was losing my mind. The next morning, I checked the footage. My hands shook as I scrolled to the timestamp. At exactly 3 a.m., the chair tilted slightly, like someone had just sat down. But there was nothing there. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The room had no windows, no draft, no way the chair could move on its own. I called Mr. Thompson. The line was quiet for a long time after I explained what happened. Then he sighed. "The previous owner," he said, voice heavy. He was odd, kept to himself. But every night, without fail, he'd lock himself in that room. "Why?" I asked, my throat dry. He said it was the only way he could stay safe. "From what?" I whispered. He never said. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. That was 2 days ago. I haven't touched the room since. I've been a trucker for almost 20 years now, and I've seen some weird things on the road. People running across highways in the middle of nowhere, cars stopped with no one inside, even a full-grown cow just standing in the middle of the road, staring at me like it was thinking about something. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever stuck with me the way this did. It was late, probably close to 1 in the morning, and I was on a long stretch of road cutting through farmland. One of those 2-lane highways where you don't see another car for miles. Just empty fields and the occasional barn with a single light on. The kind of road where if your truck broke down, you'd have to hope your cell service worked because there was no way in hell you'd find help nearby. I was on my way to drop off a load in the next state over when I saw her. A girl, maybe in her early 20s, walking along the shoulder of the road. Her clothes were dirty, her hair tangled, and she kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. I slowed down as I got closer, flicking on my high beams. She didn't even flinch, just kept walking like she was in a trance. Now, I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. Too many bad stories, too much risk. But something about this girl made my gut twist. She looked terrified. So, against my better judgment, I pulled over. I leaned across the seat and rolled down the window. "You okay? Need a ride?" She stopped walking and looked at me, her eyes wide and sunken like she hadn't slept in days. Then she whispered, "He's coming." That was it. Just those 2 words. And then she climbed into the truck without waiting for me to say anything else. I tried to ask her where she was headed, if she was hurt, if she needed to call someone. She just sat there, staring straight ahead. Her hands were clenched so tight in her lap that her knuckles were white. "Who's coming?" I asked after a while. She didn't answer. I kept driving. The nearest town was about 20 minutes away. I figured I'd drop her off at a gas station or a diner, somewhere safe. She didn't move the entire time, didn't even shift in her seat, just sat there staring. When we got close to town, I glanced over at her. "Almost there," I said. "You sure you don't want to tell me what's going on?" Silence. I turned my eyes back to the road for maybe 2 seconds, tops. And when I looked back, she was gone. The seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. There was no way she could have just disappeared. But she was gone. I damn near slammed on the brakes right there in the middle of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. I pulled into the first parking lot I saw, a 24-hour gas station, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. Had I imagined the whole thing? Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then I checked my dashcam. There she was, sitting in the passenger seat, clear as day. I drove straight to the police station. They took me seriously, probably because I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. I showed them the footage, told them exactly where I'd picked her up. One of the officers went pale the second he saw the video. He left the room and came back a few minutes later with a file. The girl's name was Emily. She'd been missing for 2 weeks. She lived on a farm not far from where I found her. Her entire family had been murdered, parents, younger brother, even the dog. Brutal stuff. But Emily? She was never found. The working theory was that whoever had killed her family had taken her. I felt sick. If she had really been there, if she was still alive somewhere, I should have done something. I barely slept that night. My brain wouldn't shut off. I kept seeing her face, hearing her whisper over and over again. "He's coming." A few days later, I found myself back on that road. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I'd see her again. Maybe I just wanted to feel like I could help somehow. The farm was still taped off, though you could tell the cops weren't there anymore. I slowed down as I passed by, my headlights sweeping over the empty driveway. And that's when I saw him, a man, standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the tree line. Too far to see his face, but I could tell he was staring right at me. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I don't know who he was. Maybe just some random guy. Maybe someone who had no reason to be there at all. Later that night, I got a call from the officer I had spoken to at the station. He told me they had gone back to the farmhouse after reviewing my footage again. They found fresh footprints, the kind you'd make if you were watching the road, waiting for someone to come back. I haven't taken that route since. I never expected to inherit anything from my uncle. He was one of those relatives you hear about but never really meet. My dad's estranged older brother, a guy who lived alone on a farm in the middle of nowhere. When he passed, the lawyer handling his estate told us the farmhouse was ours if we wanted it. Matt, my husband, was all for it. A free house? Sure. I was less enthusiastic. Something about taking over a dead relative's abandoned house didn't sit right with me. But we agreed to at least check it out. The farmhouse was old, but solid. Faded blue paint peeled from the siding, and the porch creaked under our weight. The inside smelled like dust and time, but nothing felt outright sinister. We spent the first few days cleaning. Years of neglect had left behind layers of grime, forgotten trinkets, and rusted tools. That's when we found the lockbox. It was buried in a closet under a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Heavy, rusted shut, and sealed with an old-school padlock. When Matt finally pried it open, we found letters inside. Dozens of them, all addressed to someone named Samuel. The handwriting was frantic, almost desperate. Every letter carried the same message. Keep your head down. Do not be seen. We had no idea what it meant, but it was creepy. Probably just some old family drama we'd never understand. We set the letters aside and went back to work. That's when small things started happening. First, it was easy to dismiss. A door we swore we had shut would be open in the morning. A screwdriver Matt left on the table would be on the floor. We blamed each other, or maybe a draft, or the sheer exhaustion of fixing up a house that hadn't been lived in for years. But then Lisa heard the breathing. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning. I had fallen asleep on the couch, and she had gone to bed hours earlier. She shook me awake, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. There's someone under the floor. I sat up, groggy and confused. What? I heard breathing, she said, right under the floorboards. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the crawl space under the house. Nothing but dirt and cobwebs. Maybe she was dreaming. Maybe it was just the house settling. Except things kept getting stranger. Food started disappearing. Just small things at first, an apple, a loaf of bread, a can of soup. Matt accused me of forgetting what we bought, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Then, one morning, we woke up to muddy footprints leading from the barn to our bedroom window. I felt sick. I wanted to leave, but Matt was determined to figure out what was going on. We started digging into the history of the house, trying to figure out who Samuel was. Turns out, he was a farmhand who worked for my uncle's father decades ago. No one knew much about him, just that he was quiet, kept to himself, and then one day he vanished. The footprints kept appearing. Some nights, I swore I could hear movement inside the walls. Scraping sounds, soft shuffling, like someone trying to stay hidden. Then the storm hit, a brutal one. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the trees, and at some point in the night, part of the barn collapsed. When the storm passed, we went to check the damage. That's when we found it, a hidden crawl space beneath the house. Inside, there was a makeshift living area. Old blankets, rotting food, a dented metal cup, and a journal. We flipped through it, the pages stiff with age. Most of it was unreadable, but the last entry stood out. They know I'm here. I have nowhere else to go. A cold dread settled over me. Samuel never left. He had been hiding under this house for years, evading someone. But here's the thing, some of the food, it wasn't rotting. Some of the blankets weren't old. Whoever had been living down there, they were still here, and they knew we had found their hiding place. We packed our bags that night and left. When I moved out to the farmhouse, I thought I was finally getting the peace and quiet I had been craving. After years of city life, I just wanted space, real space. The kind where you can walk outside at night and hear nothing but crickets. Where there are no neighbors blasting music at 2 a.m. or traffic keeping you up. The house itself was nothing fancy. An old white farmhouse with peeling paint and a creaky porch, surrounded by miles of cornfields. My nearest neighbor, an old guy named Hank, lived about half a mile down the dirt road. The day I moved in, he drove up on his rusty pickup, leaned out the window, and gave me one piece of advice. Whatever you do, don't go into the cornfield at night. I laughed. Why, is it haunted? Hank didn't laugh. He just shook his head and said, just don't. That was the first time I felt it. The unease. I brushed it off at the time. Figured he was just a superstitious old farmer or trying to scare the new guy. But after a few weeks, I started to understand why he said it. The first time I noticed something weird was about 2 weeks in. I was sitting on the porch one evening, drinking a beer, when I heard rustling in the corn. Not the wind, this was different. It was slow, deliberate, like something moving through the stalks. I told myself it was probably a deer and went inside. But then I started finding things. One morning, there were fresh footprints in the dirt behind my house, leading from the cornfield to my back door. They weren't mine. They were too big. Another time, I found one of my chairs on the porch moved, like someone had sat in it. Then there was the boot, a single old, worn-out work boot, placed neatly next to my back step. I locked my doors religiously after that. Then came the night I saw him. I had bought a couple of security cameras after the boot incident. One faced the front door, another the back, and a third pointed toward the edge of the cornfield. The night I checked the footage, I felt my stomach drop. At around 2:30 a.m., a man stepped out from the corn. He just stood there, staring at the house. For hours. He never moved, never shifted his weight, just stood perfectly still. Then, right before dawn, he suddenly dropped down, vanishing into the stalks. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the police. They came out, looked around, found nothing. No footprints, no boot, no evidence of anyone being there. They probably thought I was crazy, but I knew what I saw. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound had me on edge. Around 3 a.m., just as I was finally drifting off, I heard it, the slow, deliberate turn of my front doorknob. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed the knife I had started keeping next to my bed and crept toward the door. The knob rattled again. Then, just outside the door, I heard it, a whisper. "You weren't supposed to see me." I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out from sheer terror because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and the police were back at my house. They found the boot again, this time in the middle of my living room. They ran it through their system. Turns out it belonged to someone who had gone missing 10 years ago. Farmhand. Disappeared without a trace. I moved out that week.